Marin County, circa 1900. With a total population of 15,702 people, times were still fairly primitive. Dirt roads on a horse and buggy was still the main means of most people for leaving their home and getting around, and the private automobile had yet to leave its mark and change society forever. But they did have one thing, a railroad that offered commuter service, and a ferry to get them across the bay to San Francisco. The 3-foot gauge North Pacific Coast Railroad was incorporated on December 16, 1871, originally to tap into large timber holdings. Most of the railroad's backers were those of the Russian River Land Company. They constructed a slip at Sausalito, and on July 25, 1874, service to San Rafael was commenced, and ferry service across the bay for Marin passengers was instituted. The NPC expanded, conquering White's Hill and reaching Tamales, 47 miles north of Sausalito, by January 7, 1875, and by July 15, 1887, the railroad terminated at Duncan Mills. Improvements were made to the railroad throughout the 1880s, one of the major ones being double tracking of the line north of Richardson Bay, which eliminated grades. The other major improvement, which would become key for later standard gauge trains, was the completion of the tunnel at Alto in 1884. By 1894, the line from Sausalito to Almonte was double tracked, as was the line from the north portal of Alto Tunnel to San Anselmo by 1901. One of the major circumstances that ended up being a key source of passenger revenue was the construction of the San Francisco, Tamalpais, and Bolinas Railroad. Opened in 1889, it was leased to the MPC, and gained the railroad a branch to Mill Valley, a major destination of tourists by the late 1890s. By 1896, one of Marin's most major tourist draws until the late 1920s had commenced service. That service being the Mount Tamalpais Scenic Railway. The railroad operated from the Mill Valley Depot to the top of Mount Tam, and included rides in their famed gravity cars to get you back down the mountain. By this time, commuting by train to jobs in San Francisco was already becoming a common ritual in the Bay Area. To satisfy this need, the North Pacific Coast offered commuter service between San Rafael and San Anselmo and into Sausalito, with commuters also riding trains from Mill Valley to get to the ferry slip. You would think that with this story would come great success for this fledgling little railroad, but the reality of it is that there really wasn't. Despite upgrades, double tracking, and commuter service, the NPC had a horrid safety record. The history of the operation is marred with numerous wrecks and fatalities. Not only was that an issue, but the railroad's revenue and the maintenance of the ferry terminal at Sausalito was, even at that time, considered an utter disgrace. By 1902, 2 men from the founding group of Pacific Gas and Electric had started to take a keen eye to the wooden axle operation of the North Pacific Coast. Those men were John Martin and Eugene de Sabla. Martin and de Sabla were responsible for the building of the hydroelectric dams in the Sierras and bringing power to Northern California. They see value in the North Pacific Coast. Despite the terrible safety record, bad revenue, and uncertain operations, the ferry slip at Sausalito was in a very good location, and was the main entrance to San Francisco for all counties to the north at that time. One of their major interests is the steam commuter service, and the need for upgrading. With the 2 men being from PG&E, and electric traction being a new technology by the late 19th and early 20th century, they see this as an ideal way to modernize the railroad's commuter operations. This gave the Marin lines the distinction of being the first major heavy electrification of a steam railroad operation in North America. In the summer of 1902, Marin and Sonoma purchased the North Pacific Coast with a capitalization of $6 million and reorganized it as the North Shore Railroad, with the new company being officially incorporated on July 20th. The two men implement their strategy to improve the railroad almost immediately, with the primary upgrades being construction of a tunnel through White's Hill and by the reconstruction and electrification of the commute operations. Keep in mind that during this period, and with electric railways still being a fairly new idea, that most of the operations at this time were generally in the realm of city streetcar lines and lightweight interurban lines, with elevated rapid transit being the most sophisticated of its day. What is the biggest issue that needs to be solved when constructing a new electric railway? How do you get your power? The answer came with Marin and Sonoma's previous involvement with PG&E. From high in the Sierras where they had built their hydroelectric dams, they ended up stringing the longest high-voltage transmission wire in the world, 150 miles from end to end. It went from Colgate Dam to Alto, just north of Sausalito, where the railroad's first substation was built. The North Shore Railroad was revolutionary for its day, with the most major innovation being its installment of an alternating current block signal system. For the first time ever, electric trains can be run safely, at close intervals, at high speeds. As it turns out, this feat in rural Marin County ended up being the prototype for the electrification of both Grand Central and Penn stations in New York City. With elevated railways at that time being the leader in electric traction development, it was also thought that the trains would load and unload in true elevated fashion, at high-level platforms. But that was later dropped. Also in the plan was the standard gauging of the Marin commute lines, effectively eliminating the typical limitations found with narrow gauge. Third rail was adopted in favor of the traditional overhead trolley wire system invented by Frank J. Sprague. This was chosen so as to prevent potential issues with the steam freight operations that were still in abundance at that time and still narrow gauge, as can be seen by the dual gauge track in these photos. The first cars for this new service came from the St. Louis Car Company, with other cars being home-built in the North Shore's own shops. Some older narrow gauge steam coaches were also converted to standard gauge for electric operation as trailers. The roster of equipment at the beginning of the new service totaled 43 cars. The entire line from Sausalito to San Anselmo was double-tracked, with the only exception being the Alto Tunnel, which thankfully, even in the days of the narrow-gauge North Pacific Coast, was built to standard-gauge clearances. Also remaining single-tracked were the lines from San Anselmo to San Rafael, as well as the branch to Mill Valley, albeit they were still given the same re-gauging and electrification treatment as the rest of the system. The third rail, of which helped to propel trains over the line, was charged with 600 volts DC, which was stepped down from 50,000 volts AC that was generated from Colgate Dam, and flowing to Marin via the 150-mile power line. In case of a power line failure, backup steam generators were installed as a failsafe. In case of a surge from too much load with trains leaving and entering Sausalito in rapid succession, a 288-cell battery was installed. At San Rafael, they installed a motor generator for additional assistance. This was for trains that had to battle the 2% grade between San Anselmo and San Rafael. The third rail was 56-pound rail that was salvaged from the old narrow gauge for about half of the length, and the rest was new 60-pound rail laid in 30-foot sections. In yards and at Sausalito, granite insulators were the norm, with wood being the main method on all other parts of the upgraded system. Most of the right-of-way in large population centers was fenced, with cattle guards being placed at road crossings. With the exception of stations and yards, the third rail was fully exposed. The return of negative power through the running rails and back to the powerhouse was always considered inadequate due to rail bonds installed at the joints always leaking negative power. Due to this, crew members were not permitted to touch metal switch stands until at least 5 minutes after the passage of a train. Automatic block signals were installed between Sausalito and San Anselmo, as traffic volumes were sufficient enough to consider that an asset. Interesting to note that the North Shore Railroad was the first operation to employ a signaling concept that is today a universal standard for rail rapid transit. This new innovation was mainly comprised of US&S semaphore signals, and Mill Valley Junction, as well as the yard at Sausalito, were both controlled by interlocking plants. When electric operations commenced, only the double-track lines were signaled, and in Sausalito, telegraph or telephone dispatched the single-track lines from Mill Valley over to San Anselmo. Keeping track of trains over the single-track Mill Valley branch was done by telephone communication between the station agent at Mill Valley and the towerman at Mill Valley Junction. Alto Tunnel became a major bottleneck, having to be left single-track due to its clearances, and because of this, approach-indicated block signals were placed at each portal. The track circuit would trigger lamps placed along the wall on both sides of the tunnel at window level, and would remain on for the train's entire passage through the bore. Regular operation of the new electrified portion of the North Shore Railroad commenced on August 20th, 1903. One of the amazing things about all this was that during the construction period, there was no serious interruption to normal operations. On opening day, the new electric trains were considered to be a wonder of the age, with trains averaging speeds of 25 to 30 miles an hour, and easily obtaining 50 to 60 miles an hour due to lack of stations. But this would prove not to be the case in years to follow. On September 19, 1903, the first electrified run to San Rafael was made with a 10-car train loaded with 500 guests. This trip was slower than normal service, with the average speed being 30 miles an hour. This was due to the new substation at San Rafael not being constructed yet, and the fact that there was a 2% grade between San Anselmo and B Street in San Rafael. Service to B Street was officially commenced on October 17, 1903, and electrification was extended to the California Northwestern San Rafael Depot in 1906, making it the northernmost point of the electrification for a time. The first year of electrified service got off to a rough start, however. The first human fatality was on November 12, 1903, when a man at the age of 86 died at Alto after touching the third rail. Washouts and floods along the right-of-way led to service disruptions, and Corte Madera Station was destroyed by fire in January 1904. On August 16th of that same year, the first major wreck occurred, when an electric train coming off of the Mill Valley branch disregarded the stop signal at Mill Valley Junction and collided with the rear of a freight. No one was killed, but the engineer on the freight and a passenger on the commute train did sustain injuries. In the spring of 1904, for $1.5 million, E.H. Harriman of Union Pacific fame, already owning the California Northwestern Railroad, purchased the North Shore, consolidating its management under his railroad's banner. This would be a major turning point that would change the railroad's identity in a little over 2 years. Amazingly, no serious damage occurred to the operation during the Great Earthquake of April 18, 1906. However, the morning narrow-gauge passenger train was knocked on its side during the tremor, as can be seen in this photo at Point Reyes. With all this upgrading and innovation to the commute lines in Marin by the North Shore, let us not forget that the railroad was also considered to be a busy freight hauler. A big issue for the now standard gauge Marin operation was that they did not own any standard gauge steam locomotives. With a void needing to be filled, management thought it necessary to purchase a standard gauge electric locomotive, which they built in Sausalito and named Electra. The 50-ton steeple cab was rated at 500 horsepower, but was deemed unsuccessful due to it drawing so much current that it would end up slowing down and sometimes even stopping the normal commute runs. Due to this issue, the locomotive was later sold to the Pacific Electric and is now preserved at Traveltown in Griffith Park, Los Angeles. These two photos show it helping clean up 1906 earthquake damage in San Francisco, paired with steam locomotives and cleaning up debris in the street. On January 8, 1907, the North Shore, California Northwestern, and other railroads in the region were unified into the Northwestern Pacific Railroad, with SP and Santa Fe each holding $17,499,500 of common stock. After consolidation into the NWP, all passenger and ferry operations became based out of Sausalito. In order to make it practical to have Sausalito as the main terminal, a 2.64-mile line called the Cutoff was constructed at Baltimore Park, on the old North Shore Main Line, to the town of Detour, on the old California Northwestern Main Line. Service on the new line started with steam trains. However, by December 15, 1909, electric service had commenced. The main source of traffic over the Cutoff was mail, and service was not as frequent as on the old main line. This new line, however, did attract a small group of commuters, as it took a cutoff train 20 minutes to get from Sausalito to San Rafael, 15 minutes faster than a train running via San Anselmo. During this period, upgrades were being made to the electrical power plant. In 1905, before the NWP takeover, the North Shore erected a large brick building at San Anselmo. This building would house a battery charged by the powerhouse at Alto. This proved to be inadequate, as by 1908, the NWP had completed its extension to Fairfax. Due to the discrepancy, the NWP replaced it with 2 motor generators, eventually installing a third one by 1912. Alto Powerhouse also saw some upgrades. After operating from its inception with 3 steam-driven generators operated by the Colgate transmission line, 2 additional generators driven by a steam turbine were added in 1906. A 6th generator, driven by AC power, was installed by 1912. Also during this time span, the NWP increased its roster, when in 1908 they ordered 9 more wooden cars from the St. Louis Car Company, only 2 of which were motors. The name Mill Valley Junction also disappeared off the timetables and was changed to its geographical location name of Almonte, with long extra trains flying white flags becoming a common sight with the opening of Tamalpais High School. By 1913, the electrified system had reached its maximum length that it would operate until the end, when the 2.3 miles from Fairfax to Manor was given third rail and put into service on November 13th. The result of the extension to Fairfax in 1908 and the Manor extension of 1913 caused a real estate boom for this area of Marin. With the system now running at its maximum length of track, let us take this time to digress and focus on the operations of the railroad. The Pine Shops, located 1.2 miles east of Sausalito, performed all the repairs on the electric cars. and cars were turned on the turntable at the roundhouse there to weather the paint evenly on either side. It was also where the North Shore Railroad equipped the cars from the St. Louis Car Company and those removed from steam service with electrical equipment. At the time we have reached in this program, all of the cars had color classification lights mounted on their roofs to assist the towermen in the routing of the trains at junctions. And all cars carried oil-burning marker lamps at the rear. A commute trip began at the ferry building, with the NWP at the northerly slips adjacent to the Santa Fe ferries running to Richmond. NWP and Key System started using the Santa Fe slips when necessary after the Santa Fe abandoned ferry service in 1933. NWP ferries, after whistling off, would turn sharply toward the Golden Gate, and generally stayed between the waterfront docks and Alcatraz. Upon approaching Alcatraz, and passing it on the northeast, the course would then take a northwest heading, on the approach to Sausalito. Tickets were purchased for Marin-bound passengers in the ferry building, from agents borrowed from the Key System and Western Pacific during busy periods. At Sausalito, passengers leaving the ferry building would then go through a small building at the end of the dock and into the train loading area. A ferry-to-train transfer required less than 5 minutes. Trains generally departed Sausalito on close to 1-minute headway, generally with the cutoff train departing first to San Rafael via Detour and Greenbrae, followed by a combined Manners-San Rafael via San Anselmo train, with the Mill Valley train doing local work as far as Almonte departing last. Local trains were also operated, with records of local service to Kempfield circa 1905, as well as record of local trains operating between San Rafael and Manor via San Anselmo, with those trains having to run into the San Anselmo station and reverse direction to continue their journey, due to the bypass track at San Anselmo not being electrified. Trains at San Anselmo were uncoupled into 2 sections. One continued on to Manor, and the other ran to San Rafael. The reverse occurred for trains arriving at San Anselmo and bound for Sausalito. NWP's regular steam passenger service commingled with the electrics at Sausalito, and all passenger equipment was serviced at Pine. Between San Rafael, Detour, and Baltimore Park, the steam trains also shared trackage. With the steam-only track branching off at Detour to go to Tiburon. Movements through junctions were all governed by signals and interlocking towers. Tower 1 controlled movements in and out of Sausalito Terminal. Tower 2, located at Almonte, governed the junction with the Mill Valley branch. Tower 3, located at Baltimore Park, protected the junction with the cutoff line. Tower 4 was located at the San Anselmo junction, and Tower 5 was located at San Rafael, at the junction between the cutoff and the line from San Anselmo. Towers 1 and 2 were installed when the Electrified operation opened in 1903, with Tower 3 at Baltimore Park coming into the fold when it was built as part of the cutoff in 1909. San Anselmo was governed by manually operated disc signals until the completion of Tower 4 that same year, with Tower 5 being activated in 1911. The single-track line between B Street and San Anselmo was later double-tracked. That line had signals by 1913. With timetables of the period showing the single-track line from San Anselmo and Fairfax also being protected by automatic block signals. As was mentioned earlier in this program, the automatic block signal system protected only double-track territory when first installed. The single-track line between B Street in San Rafael and San Anselmo had signals by 1913. However, block signals on the Mill Valley branch were not installed until 1920. The entire line in both double and single-track sections between Baltimore Park and San Rafael via the cutoff had automatic block signals, but no tower at Detour protected the junction with the Tiburon freight line. The detour junction block signals were connected to the junction switches, normally set for the Baltimore Park to San Rafael trains. When the switches were set by the train crews, the signals were automatically set to assure a train's safe passage through the junction. With the mentioning of the Mill Valley branch receiving its automatic block signals by 1920, let us continue with our history and move on into that decade. By the 1920s, plans were called to electrify the line to Point Reyes with 1200 volts DC. However, those plans were dropped with the end of the narrow gauge steam operations south of there at the beginning of the decade. It is interesting to note that in order to prepare for this, NWP did modify the San Anselmo substation to meet the necessary provisions for the planned additional equipment. During the 1920s, there was also an increase in double track on the electrified system, and the railroad added additional interlocking towers at junctions, giving them a total of 5, as mentioned in our previous segment. They also renovated some of the stations at select locations with modern-looking Art Deco architecture. Almost $2 million was spent on improvements, with the company employing 800 people and generating a monthly payroll in Marin of 150,000 1920s era dollars. Weather was always a chronic issue for the electrics, and near Almonte there was a chronic high water problem, where the railroad skirted along Richardson Bay as it left Sausalito. Third rail on the Mill Valley branch was also prone to shorting out during times of heavy rain and high tide in that area. Some of these conditions got so bad that in February of 1925, the entire system shut down for a week due to heavy rain and severe flooding. Despite that, the 20s seemed to be a rather prosperous time for the NWP, as during this time they had a transit monopoly over southern Marin County, which helped the company discourage the flow of trucks, buses, and automobiles between there and San Francisco. This reluctance amongst railroad officials to bring new transport in resulted in the railroad becoming very active in legal battles to block the construction of the Golden Gate Bridge. However, a breakup in the NWP transit monopoly started to rear its head when Henry E. Spees incorporated the Golden Gate Ferry Company, after being stranded in Sausalito while trying to obtain space on an NWP ferry in 1922. A big blow to the railroad was that Golden Gate Ferry's fleet also accommodated autos and buses, causing a serious dip in revenue. NWP's image declined even further by 1927, when the railroad went to court defending before the Marvelous Marin Boosters Group, who at that time was complaining to the California Railroad Commission. The group claimed the NWP was making no efforts to improve the commuter service. In these accusations, the citizens demanded that the third rail be replaced with overhead, the roadbed improved for a system-wide speed of 60 miles per hour, a modernized fleet of faster ferries, and that all wooden cars be retired. The most grandiose request in all of these complaints, however, was that regarding Alto Tunnel, with the group demanding that it should be double-tracked and widened. It was also mentioned in these hearings that the stations had so little protection that a patron invited serious illness when transferring from a train to the ferry slip at Sausalito. It was also said that a resident patched up a depot in Almonte on his own, claiming that it offered less protection than his chicken cage at home. During the last day of these trials, an official from another railroad on the case was quoted saying, "Aside from the fact that the rolling stock is antiquated, the electrical system is inadequate, and some of the stations are ready to tumble down, the NWP is in excellent shape in Marin." The next decade plus saw improvements to the system, though not to the scopes of what the railroad's critics demanded, and not all were from the hearings of the 1920s. By the end of the 1920s, all of the commuter territory, with the exception of the Mill Valley branch and Alto Tunnel, had been double-tracked, with the last section being completed in San Rafael at B Street, which included a new station. A new drawbridge on the cutoff was also constructed at Green Brae, and the tunnel there was double-tracked at the same time. The power system was also improved. From 1929 to 1930, a substation at Pine had replaced the battery at Sausalito, and construction began on a new substation at Baltimore Park. That structure is still standing in the year 2017. Some of the old wooden trailers during this period were converted to motors, as the need for more cars for service over the electrified sections was becoming more and more apparent. In comes the most dramatic and visible of all these modernization efforts, with the arrival of 19 steel and aluminum-bodied cars for use in commuter service, being delivered between 1929 and 1930. These cars were similar to SP's interurban electric railway cars that ran in Oakland, Alameda, and Berkeley, but they had fewer windows due to the seats being spaced farther apart. But they were capable of speeds of 50 to 55 miles per hour, over 10 miles per hour faster than their SP sisters. Due to their increased speed capabilities, these cars were eventually given the nickname of hot rods. They were equipped with electrical equipment from Westinghouse, of which the company stated that the NWP station stops were on average 20 seconds, with an average of 1.2 stops per mile, with an average third rail voltage of 550. They were also fitted with Westinghouse traction brake automatic couplers and normally operated as a motor-trailer tandem. The fleet was made up of 12 motors and 7 trailers. The automatic couplers connected the electrical circuits and air brakes all in one, eliminating the need for air hoses and jumper cables between the cars. Even with the 19 new steel cars now in service, schedules still were demanding enough that the wooden cars had to be retained to supplement service. The schedule in 1932 called for 136 commuter trains on an average day. Business on the electric operations was so poor, however, that the steel cars were never repainted on the NWP, and their bright orange over time faded to what fans call a semi-pink. The new substations at Pine and Baltimore Park were pressed into service. They were constructed to meet the new power demands of the steel cars upon arrival. By 1930, the power supply was considered more or less modern, with the steam-driven equipment only retained for emergencies at Alto, with the facility essentially becoming a substation, with 60,000 volts AC from PG&E being converted by motor generators. Alto was the only power station to require an operator. 1930 also marked the official end of the narrow-gauge steam operations, with the abandonment of the line north of Point Reyes. All of the equipment was brought into Sausalito on flat cars and scrapped. This time period also brought a major blow to one of the NWP Electric's most important revenue generators. In 1929, a severe brush fire on Mount Tamalpais damaged the Mill Valley branch, part of the town, and condemned the Mount Tamalpais and Muir Woods Railway, previously known as the Mount Tamalpais Scenic Railway. The tourist line was put back into service in 1930, but was abandoned later that year due to the results of the Great Depression. This loss made for a serious dip in ridership on the NWP Electrics. A major change in corporate ownership was also happening, when on January 17, 1929, the Santa Fe sold its shares in the NWP to the SP, after realizing the lines were too remote to give the railroad any significant benefit. SP, now sole owner of the NWP, was content with replacing a good portion of its passenger service with buses of Pacific Greyhound lines, of which they owned a large share of. Lawsuits at the federal level were also being filed in a continued attempt to block construction of the Golden Gate Bridge. The lawsuits had no effect, as Chief Engineer Joseph B. Strauss capitalized on the negative attitudes of the public towards the railroad, and formed the Bridge District, which was passed by the California legislature and organized formally on January 23, 1929. After Bank of America bid 5% to the Bridge District bond, construction of the Golden Gate Bridge was officially approved. Doom for the NWP's electric operation was imminent once the bridge was officially opened on May 27, 1937, and by 1938, the NWP was losing $200,000 annually. That same year, the railroad sent a request to the Railroad Commission to abandon, which they approved. Abandonment was delayed, however, with a small band of commuters making a last-ditch effort to increase ridership. This opposition forced the NWP to keep running trains at a reduced schedule with increased fares. This fare increase made NWP the highest fare in the region, charging 35 cents as opposed to the SP and Key system both charging 21 cents. Due to this increase, the NWP ended up losing 13% of its riders from December 1939 to January 1940. But the increase was thought to offset those expected losses. The extreme loss in ridership is blatantly seen in this comparison of ridership and fare figures from one day in 1930 compared to a 3-week period in January of 1940. On April 30th, 1930, there were 14,317 fares collected, 7,117 riders northbound, and 7,200 southbound, with the ferries operating at maximum capacity, with 1,625 patrons northbound and 1,179 patrons southbound. Compare this to a 3-week period of January 1st to January 17th, 1940. The weekday average for those 3 weeks breaks down as follows. Week 1 had 7,815 patrons, Week 2 had 7,798, and Week 3 had 7,981. And those combined figures are of the trains and ferries. And by this time, Marin's population had grown to 52,907 people. Even in those days, the idea of transportation as a publicly funded district was tossed around, and 2 attempts were made to preserve the NWP electric lines in that fashion. The voters defeated the first attempt on November 7, 1939, which was a planned district formation to acquire the electric system. But Mill Valley residents endorsed a bus line and ordered 5 new buses. And by May 21, 1940, authorization to abandon the electrified trackage was officially granted. The first of the services to be abandoned was the Mill Valley branch, which ceased on October 1, 1940, the exception being the extra trains to Tamalpais High School, as the school had yet to receive 14 buses. The truncated system operated for another 4 months until the final full day of operation on February 28, 1941. But what is the end of any railroad operation without a last ride? And 5 days before Abandonment Day, the Pacific Division of the Railroadians of America did just that. The official flyer for the excursion reads as follows. The Pacific Division of the Railroadians of America invites you to be its guest on February 23rd on the NWP Electric Division Sonoma Valley Excursion, your last opportunity to inspect the electric lines before their abandonment on February 28th. The 9 a.m. ferry from San Francisco will connect with a special train of wooden equipment hauled by the 23, the last remaining 440 on the Northwestern Pacific, for a 9-hour excursion over the Electric Division and little-used branches, returning to San Francisco at 5:45 p.m. The train will visit Mill Valley, San Anselmo, San Rafael, Ignacio, Shelville, Sonoma, and Tiburon, with stops of 30 minutes at the Sausalito shops, 1 hour at Sonoma, 30 minutes at San Rafael, and 50 minutes at Tiburon. Special arrangements are being made for the spotting of equipment at Sausalito and Tiburon to ensure the best possible results in photographing. Stops will be made at interesting points en route for inspection or picture taking. The following unusual situations will be experienced: a trip over the 3 branches which are without passenger service, Mill Valley, Sonoma Valley, and Tiburon, riding behind an engine specially resurrected from the scrap line for this excursion, the 23, sole survivor of the NWP's once large fleet of 440s, the opportunity to inspect the shops at Sausalito and Tiburon and photograph all available equipment, inspection of the historical monuments of early California at Sonoma, Sonoma Mission, the Bear Flag Monument, old adobe buildings, etc., and a baggage car attached to the train will supply sandwiches, milk, and assorted soft drinks. Stops at Sonoma and San Rafael will give you time to enjoy your lunch. Film supplies of all types will be carried in the baggage car. Don't burden yourself with film. Buy it on the train as you need it. Steam fan, juice fan, train rider, or companion, you'll enjoy the program we have mapped out for you. Bring your wife, your sweetheart, your sister, your brother, your cousin, your mother, your father, or anyone you can think of who likes the good-natured companionship of a rail excursion. They'll all enjoy themselves. Warning: the supply of tickets for this trip is definitely limited. Don't delay your reservation until the last minute and be disappointed. Tickets may be purchased from D.S. Richter, Secretary, 1412 6th Avenue, San Francisco, or from NWP and SP ticket offices. The time, February 23rd at 9 a.m. The place, NWP Slip, Ferry Building, San Francisco. The occasion, Railroadians NWP Electric Division Sonoma Valley Excursion. The price, only $1.50. We'll see you there. Railroadians of America, Pacific Division. And in this day and age with today's railroading scene, it's really amazing to think that all that was happening on one excursion. And after the last official fan trip came the last official day of operation. On that windy and dreary day, the inclement weather ended up delaying some of the trains. Despite this, one mournful fan was quoted saying, "There was a higher voltage of celebrants on the final trips than in the third rail." The final southbound run left San Rafael at 10 p.m., and the last trains were delayed due to the Eureka experiencing inclement wind and tide conditions out on the bay. SP police were out as well, riding the last train to receive destination signs taken by passengers. Electric operations officially ended at 3:01 a.m. on March 1st, with a deadhead of 14 of the steel cars, said to be the longest train of that equipment ever run on the NWP. Following the fateful last runs, Greyhound buses became the new main method of intercity transit for Marin residents. Looking back now, it is rather astonishing to think that we had an electric railroad operation that broke barriers, innovated strongly, set standard in the industry, and became an inspiration for some of railroading's most iconic places. And it all happened in a small isolated corner of California known as Marin County.